Tony, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me here.
So you are Tony Woodlief, and you are the author of the very hot bestseller, I, Citizen.
I like how you put that.
Yeah.
Yes, I am.
It's flying off the shelves.
It really is.
And we should dig into this because I think you're going to solve all the problems for people that are frustrated with big government.
I'm going to help them solve their own problems.
Nice.
Yeah.
The revolution is here. A movement of people free to live, work, and choose. We won't tell you what to think. We just demand that you think for yourself. This is Kibbe on Liberty.
I think whatever you choose to do in this environment that you own is manly by definition.
This is my man cave, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about Herbert Spencer if we want to.
By definition, it's
Yeah.
manly. Done by a man.
You know, we were talking about coffee earlier, and my joke, which is not really a joke, is if you want to know the best coffee shop, just make sure the barista has a neck tattoo, and
Nice.
perhaps a man bun.
I got you.
That's optional.
Mm-hmm.
But you had a story to tell us about the proper making of a Manhattan.
Sure. Okay. So this guy out of nowhere emails me because he followed me on Twitter or he read something I wrote, and he's like, "Hey, I'm going to be in your neck of the woods a week after Christmas. Can I stop by?" And this is like June. So you don't think about the time that's coming. You think, well, right now that sounds like a pleasant idea. Sure, pal, stop by,
Yeah.
you know. And so then we get closer to the date, and he emails me to remind me, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy's coming. Put it out of my head. And then around 11 a.m., there's a knock on the door. And I thought this would be later in the day. And here he is on my doorstep. And I open the door, and this dude is like 6'3", and he's got tattoos all over, and he's got like a neck tat and stuff. And I'm thinking, maybe I fell for something. Maybe he, like my mother told me once, one day you're going to write something that's going to get you shot.
Yeah.
And I thought, maybe he's here to shoot me. And so I thought, should I go get my gun? But then I have to tuck it in my pants. I've never done that. I'll probably shoot myself in the ass. I'm going to deal with it here. All right. Stay near the knives. We sit down, and he's a wonderful person. And he tells me this kind of, life story of growing up. His whole family was drunks. He grew up in a bar, basically. Was in a motorcycle gang for a while, a crime-filled life. And then he found Jesus, and now he's got 18 kids on a compound in Idaho, something like that, right? So we hang out for a while, for hours. And it's okay, but the whole time I'm sort of resentful that he's taking up all my time. We get towards the evening, and I said, hey, let me make us a drink. He says, that sounds great. I said, I'll make a Manhattan, because I thought I knew how to make one. So I make a Manhattan, and he drinks it dutifully. And then he says, you know what? Let me make the next round. And I'm thinking, okay, show me a Manhattan. And then he does it entirely differently with a twist of lemon, if you can believe that. There's a whole thing you can do. It's delicious. It's wonderful. Now we're drinking, and we're like, hey, what else can you make? And he's like, here, what do you got? Here's some rum. Here's a lime. He makes this other thing. It's delicious. And now I'm thinking, this guy's great. I'm so glad he's here. And that's when he says, well, I got to go. And he leaves, and I never heard from him again. But he left the recipe for a great Manhattan. So that's the story.
I thought this could be a metaphor for like the final chapter in your book where you're saddened by the lack of gathering that modern America, because I joke, and I don't think it's a joke, but I feel like having a beer or two and getting together to work out differences is sort of the essence of what makes America great.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was just lamenting this because my 18-year-old bought a real crappy car. Sorry if you're watching, Isaac, but it's a rust bucket. But he's been fixing it up, and he put these mufflers on that I guess they're designed for teenagers to drive cars that sound like they're a lot faster than they really are.
Yeah.
And it does. And the thing is, every time he drives down the street, I'm thinking, oh, God, the neighbors are going to get so mad at us. And sure enough, some neighbor flags him down. She's like, young man, you're driving too fast through this neighborhood. And he says, I only do 35. This car can barely get up to 35. I'm not speeding. She said, you're driving too fast. I might have to talk to your parents. So he warns me, and I'm thinking, to my shame, I've never spoken to this woman before. She's got a great big yard up the street. We got our stuff back in the trees. Never talked to my neighbor. And now the first time we may talk is because my son is irritating her with his driving. And I think that's often how it works, is you don't really meet your neighbor until the dog is barking and it's irritating you, or a tree limb falls on your fence or something like that.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to get past that because I'm so comfortable in my home, in my routines. But
well, it's I think so. Here we are in the belly of the beast, and I think if I could characterize the theme of what you're trying to get at is, and I'll use my words, not yours, and you can tell me how wrong I got it, but we've sort of outsourced everything to a third party, and that third party has more and more become centralized here in Washington, D.C., and that sort of relieves us of the responsibility of being a good person, a good citizen. And I've always described liberty as that burden that you feel when you look in the mirror in the morning, and like, did I do what I needed to do?
Yeah.
And will I do that today? And that's one of the mythologies I think about individual liberty, is that this caricature that it's somehow do whatever you want and I don't give a damn about anything else. I think it's almost the opposite, that the burden of taking responsibility for yourself first, as Jordan Peterson might teach us, or your neighbors and your community, and work your way from the bottom up. To me, that's a full understanding of liberty.
I think that's right. I think it was Hayek that wrote about how in a centralized economy, even though there's all these decisions being made at the top about how to run everything, there are many, many, many more decisions in a free society, because we all have to make decisions about our own property and lives and our social arrangements. And so in some ways, you're taking that autonomy and authority and moral responsibility away from people. And I think something happens to a person when they no longer have to make moral choices.
Yeah.
They may not become immoral, but they, in some respects, become amoral, maybe, which is not completely, fully the life you're supposed to have. Right?
Or even like morally lazy, where you're like, oh, they got that in D.C.
Yeah.
The guy that I just voted for said he was going to take care of the poor. So that's not my thing.
So I don't have to.
Yeah.
Yeah. That I think that's exactly right.
And it's corrosive. And I'll take a step back and I feel like, so you've written a book called I, Citizen, and I feel like what you're trying to deal with is the hyper tribal partisanship that seemingly is much worse today than it was even a few years ago. I think that's true. I spend so much time on Twitter, I don't know if I have a clean understanding of what's actually going on in the world, and I also live on Capitol Hill, so I really don't have a chance for understanding reality. But it does seem, and do you agree that this real angry tribalism is stronger today than it was even 20 years ago?
I'll say yes and no, which I know is kind of a wimpy answer. Yes, it's clear, for example, just you can look at the sort of these empirical studies of news coverage, and you see that coverage of polarization, of American polarization, left versus right, Republican, Democrat, has gone way up in the past 15 years. So there's more stories about how we can't agree. And those stories, about 70% of them tend to feature a man in the street kind of style, which is never a randomly chosen man in the street. It's someone chosen in advance to advance your thesis. So we know there's more coverage of polarization. We know that there's less kind of cross-party, bipartisan voting in Congress, for example, that members of Congress are much more polarized, and there's much more rancor and distrust among those people that I would say are in the political class. However, most Americans are not in that political class, so they are not highly ideologically motivated or attentive. They don't have a firm commitment to a political party. Majority now identify as independent and jump back and forth between parties across time. So most people are just watching this and being told that that's America. When it's really not.
Yeah, and I think the latter is more true, and what kind of gives me hope for people is I almost feel they're rational enough not to really pay attention to the silliness that we do here in Washington, D.C. And sometimes it's frustrating to me because some things they need to be paying attention to, lest they be forced into a top-down paradigm that will not allow them to think for themselves. I was thinking about this, and you mentioned the Better Arguments Project in your book, and I have a story to tell about hyperpartisanship. 5-6 years ago now, I was participating in a PBS debate hosted at the University of Virginia, and it was on polarization.
Oh boy!
So they set up a debate on polarization. and they put me and George Will on one side.
Oh yeah.
And a professor from the University of Seattle, whose name I don't remember, and a guy who's a friend of mine, Eric Liu, who started the Better Arguments Project much later. And much to the disappointment of the moderator, Eric, who is very progressive, and myself, who is not progressive at all, we started having a conversation instead of an argument.
Yeah.
And it was very frustrating, proving perhaps that polarization wasn't necessary. But I do think, and I've learned this from hanging out, by the way, this must be Joe Biden flying by right now. He's upset that we're having a civil conversation.
Well, I saw a helicopter, presidential or whatever, vice presidential, fly over the bridge when I was coming over.
Yeah.
So maybe something's going on. They're going to solve a problem somewhere.
Yeah.
That's it.
But and I've told the story 1,000 times. But hanging out with my new progressive friends taught me how little I understood about conversation and language, because they were using a totally different set. Using the same words, but they're using them differently than I was, to the point where I didn't actually understand what they were saying. And so it took me some time to try to empathetically understand where they were coming from when they used language. And that's part of the reason that I think that we argue to no avail, is that we don't listen.
Yeah.
And say, like, you know what do you mean when you say that? Because we have these phrases, and libertarians are more guilty than anyone else, but we have these go-to phrases that we use that probably mean nothing to anyone outside of our tribe.
Yeah, that's right. So I think intellectuals will develop a shorthand, in some respects, really because it's just faster to have the conversation, right, with people who understand the shorthand. But then there's also, in the people who are more tribally minded, the verbiage is more signaling. It's like a little ping. It's like you're a firefly, right? Sending out a signal to find the female or male of your particular firefly species. You want to attract them and put the others on notice. And so I think that's where it begins to break down. In fact, I talk about in the book another organization that does some focus group work called Heart and Mind. I interviewed a couple of their researchers, and they bring together people, a diverse array, truly diverse, not just Harvard, poster diverse, but actual diversity of class and experience. Bring them together, and they have conversations about hard topics: abortion, joblessness, addiction. And what they're really trying to do is understand, how do people learn one another's language so that they can talk to each other. And they said something that fascinated me, which is they have to do a pre-survey, because about 1 in 5 potential participants is so politically poisoned that they can't have that conversation. The minute it gets started, they're sending out little comments like the firefly to see, well, who are my people and who are my enemies in this room? So they do a pre-survey now. They've learned how to screen them out, and they don't let them in the room.
Yeah.
And then regular people can have a conversation. They don't agree, but they can at least hear each other, understand the language that the other is using. And that's all we're really asking for. Because we can understand each other. If I can agree, okay, you're not a bad person. I don't want what you want. I'm going to vote against you, but you're not bad. We're not going to kill each other, right? We're going to maybe even like each other.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what's being taken from us.
You use examples, and I want to get into these words: Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, which we use interchangeably, but perhaps we shouldn't. But you use one example. You use is the partisan nature of George W. Bush's war on terror, and I remember the anti-war movement back then. I sometimes wonder where it is today, but. Republicans to a person would call you unpatriotic, un-American if you didn't support the president's war. Yep. And then flip the script when Obama started droning everybody. And there was exceptions to this. Obviously, Rand Paul stepped up and called out both parties on such a thing. But it just, when Obama was doing it, it was a righteous progressive project. When Bush was doing it, it was evil, and vice versa.
Yeah, that's right.
Why?
So when I talk about the political class some in the book, and what I'm getting at is first of all, I try to be clear. There's nothing wrong with the ideology as long as the content of the ideology is not evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if your ideology is that the rest of the world must live the way you want, well, that's evil.
Yeah.
Right. But if your ideology is, I want to live in a community like this and we want to have these rules and so on, okay, fine. Ideologues are not the problem. It's when we marry ideology with political tribalism, it becomes poisonous. And the reason is because your beliefs become malleable. Not just the facts, right, that you believe, but what you believe is right or wrong. And so we saw that where, when George W. Bush is in office, Nancy Pelosi is a staunch opponent, right, of the federal government spying on everyone, spying on journalists and everyone else. But then the moment her guy is in office, she was the critical vote to preserve a lot of those NSA spying powers because her guy was in office. And I promise you, she did not lose any sleep over it.
Right.
It didn't even occur to her that there's an inconsistency because that's what happens. Hannah Arendt talked about this, about totalitarianism. It breeds this alienation from others, an alienation from reality, and ultimately an alienation from yourself, right? You are disconnected from all these things, and then you become this cog, caught up in this hysteria. And that's what political ideologues have become.
Yeah, yeah. So I wonder if it's less ideological in any sense, except they believe in power. And I guess that's what a definition of authoritarianism is, as opposed to opportunism. Like you want to hurt the other team so that you can have the majority. And obviously that was part of her motive in that. Yeah. And it's kind of hard to distinguish sometimes between these spouted ideologies of the political class versus their real motives, which is just accumulating power.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's I can't divine what they tell themselves, but I think that you're right, Matt, that there's this signaling to their base, their tribe, and they've got to feed that tribe and keep them angry because that keeps them compliant.
Yeah.
But you're right, they don't necessarily have any agenda other than control and power, and so they can switch sides quite easily, quite nimbly, which is why one of the things I look at in the book is you can go back to the 50s and you can find some studies. There's problems with all this polling, but insofar as you can trust the polling, there's some indication that there was, in the 50s, you had maybe 12% of the population that was really deeply ideological in some respects, and about 50-50 left and right. And today it's around 22%. But the thing is, it doesn't look like that was a uniformly increasing across time. If it were just increasing at a steady rate, we'd get well into this century before more than half the country is, a drone in Team Red and Team Blue. But I think what you would find if we had more data is instead it's been this rapid upward slope since the 90s for a lot of reasons, which means we're getting closer every year to a majority of the country really being invested in red versus blue, that kind of mindset, and turning off their reasoning brains. And that's very dangerous, right?
What do you think drives that?
So Robert Putnam would say, and I pick on him some in the book, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in his work. He would say, well, if you don't have other kind of social engagements, you don't have church anymore, you don't have the Rotary Club, you don't have Little League and stuff, then you can get overly invested in politics as a form of catharsis and connection, and a cheap one too. Like it's cheap emotional connection. So I think that could be part of it. I think a deeper challenge is that, and a lot of political scientists have written about this, you've had what's called a party sorting, which means, you can go back to the 80s and you could find Democrats who were for gun rights, Republicans who were for abortion rights, but they've really sorted themselves so that you're over here on a lot of things. And Americans, it's much harder then to find somebody in their own tribe, if they're in a political tribe, that disagrees with them on anything. We agree on everything, and the other side agrees with us on nothing, therefore they're evil. We have no cross-cutting pressures to keep us together. And so it becomes a problem when more people then begin to invest in politics. The good news for now, the buffer is most people are not invested in politics, which drives the political class crazy. And that's what they're trying to change. Right?
Is the people that aren't invested in politics, are they registering as independents or are they simply not registering?
So that's a great question. You'll find some research into people who are unregistered and comparing those to people who are registered, and you generally will find unregistered, so they're not voting, tend to have lower levels of everything, knowledge, awareness, socioeconomic class, and so on. They've got other concerns in life, like getting by, than anything else, for right or for wrong. When you think about people who are not registered with a party, now in some states that's just by design. The state does not, you don't register with a party, so you're just, you. We do know from the data we have about people who are not registered with a party, they're unaffiliated, when they have a choice to affiliate. A lot of political scientists disagree, and we can get into the reasons they're wrong, but what we do know is that the people who are independents will go back and forth between parties over time. They're not firmly committed to one side or the other, no matter what Nate Silver says or anybody else. They vacillate. And the reason you do see consistency in voting, so you'll see a county like this is a red county, this is a red precinct, they voted the same way for the past 4 cycles, is not so much that these people are really excited about the Republicans. It's that they're a little bit to the right, and the people the Democrats nominate to them are crazy. Now, the Republicans are kind of crazy too, but they're a little less crazy. Yeah. So if they're going to vote, they vote this way. They're not excited. So then that means there's this huge opportunity for candidates and parties to begin to field people who maybe not in the middle in the sense that they want to split the difference, but who are willing to take some from both sides. Pro-liberty on this, pro-liberty on that, and put it together into a different kind of candidate.
It's funny, as a libertarian, I've always considered myself either outside or to the far end of some made-up spectrum. But in the last couple of years, I feel like I'm right in the middle because I'm just like, can't we just get along? I have these ideas about cooperation that might solve a lot of these problems, and I'll call it the middle, but it's not really, because I've flipped the spectrum where on the bottom is authoritarianism of all its flavors, and as you move up, you get more towards like respect and cooperation.
I think so if you follow Marty Macri, who's a Johns Hopkins doctor, or this guy who calls himself Z-Dog, also not epidemiologist, he's somewhere in that medical field. They talk about this term they call the altmiddle. And what Macri, it's so brilliant. I'm so jealous because he's not a political scientist, but he brings this kind of political theory to it. And he says, altmiddle, it's not that they want to take, split down the middle. Well, we want a tax rate of 40% because the Dems want 80 and the Republicans want 10. It's simply if you've got a thesis and an antithesis, that's left and right, then the synthesis is to take what's reasonable from both. Yeah. And so, for example, when it comes to COVID, right, of course you should have masks and vaccines, right? But you shouldn't force them on people. So it's taken from both sides. Or immigration, and this is borne out in the data, public opinion data. Most Americans believe immigration's pretty darn good, right? We should have it. But they also believe if somebody is an immigrant and commits a crime, you should throw his ass right back out of the country with no extended kind of effort to look into it. Just throw him out, which is kind of right wing in the thinking. But open borders with very stern, swift, maybe even unfair justice, that's how most Americans think. It's the synthesis of the left and the right. And you find that on a lot of issues.
It's the absurdity of the old left-right spectrum where you had Hitler on one end and Pol Pot on the other, and we were at the same time taught that if you split the difference, it would be okay. I don't want to split the difference between those guys. That's like double evil.
Yeah, that's right. Because you can't even decide. Pick your form of evil. That's just like wimpy evil. Yeah. It's even worse. But that's what a lot of pollsters do, academic pollsters, is they have in their minds a left-right continuum that is so outdated. And then they they ask regular Americans all these questions about how they feel about health care and taxes and immigrants and abortion and the role of women in the workplace. And then they force them into this continuum. And then they're frustrated when most people aren't consistently liberal or conservative. And then the icing on the cake, they take that data and they say, well, most Americans are ignorant and don't know what they want. Subtext, therefore we shouldn't trust them. Democracy isn't trustworthy. Let the experts decide. Yeah. And unfortunately, there's people on the right who carry that message as well.
Yeah, one of my most hated phrases in politics is low information voter. Because as someone that has I'm sort of Austrian inclined, and I've read my Hayek, and by that definition, we're all low information voters. Yeah. In fact, we're all radically ignorant of what the future holds for us. Yeah. But I think it's a conservative thing to complain about low information voting, but certainly the entire progressive project is sort of this elitist philosophy that says, you know, people are too dumb to do this. Should we trust them with voting?
That's right.
It comes down like democracy's become this term of fealty now. Like they say it with a special tone in their voice.
Right.
And democracy apparently means as long as the people vote the right way, democracy's awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
Otherwise, they're too dumb.
Right, that's right. Both sides play that game of, you know, if we win, it was a clear, you know, endorsement of everything we want to do. Now voters go away and watch TV, and we'll take it from here. So they don't really believe in democracy, either side. And if they lose, well, somebody infiltrated the democratic process and stole it from us. But neither side really believes in democracy, because if you really believed in democracy, you would put a lot more authority into communities and let people decide for themselves. And the left and the right both hate that. And a lot of Americans, I think, would be afraid of it because they've been told that their fellow Americans are intolerant, evil, stupid.
Yeah.
You know, I was on some show and I was making the argument for community authority, community autonomy, like the founders intended. And this caller calls in and she says, well, if we did that, we'd have slavery again. And I'm like, ma'am, do you really think most of your fellow Americans would vote for slavery today? Is that what you think? And she really did. She thought, well, these are my neighbors that I've never met, you know. So
this ultimately is, I think, the result of, and I'm going to pick on your most evil president, Woodrow Wilson. I learned something. I knew he had a PhD, but I didn't realize it was in political science.
Yeah. Yeah,
so he's
my enduring shame,
and that's your PhD.
That's right.
So we're going to judge accordingly.
Yeah, I deserve it.
Yeah, but thinking about the Wilsonian attitude, incredibly elitist. He had great disdain for people, and I finally put those two words together, and I was thinking we did another project going back on the ancient history of socialism. And there's a French aristocrat named Saint-Simon, who is supposedly the founding father of socialism, although his acolytes picked up the term right after he died. But he also had this idea that you could take and Hayek's written a whole book criticizing Saint-Simon, the counter-revolution of science, that he had this idea that you could take the successes of the so-called hard sciences and apply them to human action. Apply them to politics. And I think he even called it a science of politics. And when you really dig deep into that, it's not treating people as humans, it's treating them as atoms. And rearranging and manipulating and making sure that the scientists, the smart ones, have the power to manipulate things. To me, that mindset is the source of almost all of our problems.
Well, yeah, I think this is why authoritarianism always ends in mass graves, because your subjects won't behave the way your models say they should. And so then you become a Puritan, right? The only explanation is they're evil, right? So, Pol Pot, you mentioned Pol Pot. They took it to the extreme. We need to kill everyone. You know, this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau on steroids. We got to kill everyone who's had any contact with the West and start over because the West itself is corrupting. There's always this resort in the end to blaming the people for the failures of their masters, you know, the scientific overseers.
Even Marx and Lenin had this attitude that violence was a good thing because you were really rebooting society.
Yeah.
And violence is sort of baked into the cake, which is fascinating to me. I don't think a single self-described democratic socialist would acknowledge that or even be aware that rebooting society, forcing people to do things they don't want to do, is inherently violent.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But it comes out. You know, I had a friend who's a progressive friend, and he used to joke that, and you know, in the heart of every progressive is an iron-fisted, autocrat just waiting to come forward.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know how you. I think sometimes we don't see the uglier side because we're not in one of those countries that gets sideways with a George W. Bush or an Obama, right? We're not the recipient of the drones and the manipulation and the CIA, this and that and the other. we become compliant here, and so they don't have to turn the ugly side towards us. They can use gentler means. But you saw in Canada, right? And you have these truckers trying to, in some way, express their anger, and they're breaking the law. And you saw, Justin Trudeau, this should have been a magazine model, not a world leader. He goes to the banks, right? And he's going to freeze everyone's assets, not just their assets, but anyone who, thinking they were giving to a legitimate cause because it was legitimate when they gave the money, their assets can be frozen too. You see this snarl, right? It's like that moment in Lord of the Rings when, Bilbo wants to see the ring again, and he's this little old man, and then the little monster comes out for a second, and that's every kind of progressive.
That's Justin Trudeau. I obsessed about the Canadian truckers and very much was sympathetic to their incredibly nonviolent direct action, as the left would say. Yeah. And the response from the left was literally that democracy is attacking democracy, and this is undemocratic, and we must save democracy.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I guess I don't even know what that means then.
My progressive friends, I've seen my friends on the right. It's always that telling moment when your friends on the left or the right will call for violence against people who are breaking the norm in some way, whether it's these ranchers out west who are trying to fence stuff off or use federal lands that they say they're not given access to. My liberal friends are like, shoot them, throw them in jail. They're breaking the law. I'm like, really? You were kind of applauding when people are rioting in the streets and burning stuff, And then my right-wing friends are like, shoot them. They're marching, shoot them. They're being disorderly. And I'm thinking, you guys are really just right on the edge of supporting a dictator. We all imagine we would never support a dictator. We would never support a Hitler or a Ho Chi Minh or whatever. But for some people, they're just this close to it. They just haven't had the reason to yet.
Well, I wonder if tribal politics forces us to sort of fall back on that resolution of violence on things, because it feels like, and I'll give sympathy for sort of populist reactionaries who are just frustrated. They're pissed, and right now it's the right, and people are angry at Washington D.C. They're angry at the political class. They see the collusion of big business and big government. And they see people like Pelosi enriching themselves at the expense of everybody else, at inflation and lockdowns and all this stuff on top of this. I sort of feel their pain. I feel the righteous anger that they have towards the system, and they don't necessarily know what to do about it. Yeah. So they slide back into this, well, we got to elect our guys so we can punish the guys that did this to us.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's a death spiral.
It is, and this is my frustration with some of my friends on the right. I'm in neither party. I'm one of those independents. Some of my Republican friends, their mindset is that we can just get our guy in the White House. He can fix stuff. And the reality is, this is the beast we've created. You've got a Congress that no longer exercises any kind of oversight over the federal bureaucracy, a bureaucracy that's just metastasized. So now for every law passed by Congress, you have 28 rules created by federal agencies that have the full force of law. Nobody knows what they mean until you get sideways with them. And so Congress doesn't do anything. The president can't do anything. Look at George W. Bush trying to rescind the roadless rule, which governed, what kind of roads you could build into the national forests to maintain them, get the dead wood out, get the diseased wood out so you don't have these massive forest fires. His whole presidency. He's the president, right? They report to him. He couldn't change it, right? So the notion that you're going to elect this great guy who's going to go in there and fix stuff, he's going to drain the swamp or whatever, it's a fantasy at this point. The president can't control the bureaucracy. Nobody can in Washington. There are not enough people in Washington to do it.
But the slide, like if George W. Bush was trying to do that today, perhaps he could do it, because what's happened, you could go even back before George W. Bush, but governance by executive order, or just blind bureaucracy. And sometimes the bureaucracy acts against the president's will, but certainly in the last 2 years with lockdowns, the arbitrariness and I would argue the unconstitutional behavior of the executive is a real thing, and no one seems to care.
Yeah, that's right. The challenge even there is you have something called the Administrative Procedures Act, and the left is much more adept at using that machinery to stop the right. When the right takes power in D.C., the left is very good at opposing the right's actions. This is why, at least in a couple of cases that went to the Supreme Court, it was, I believe, just really ineptitude on the part of Trump appointees that they got stopped by the judiciary because they had not done things properly, their deregulation properly, using the Administrative Procedures Act. And so even the executive order at this point is of limited use compared to what all the dark matter these agencies issue. It's not even governed by the regulatory process anymore. It's memoranda and dear colleague letters that get the compliance they want without ever being subjected to any kind of review.
Yeah.
So you got to figure out how you're going to fight that. And of course, what I argue is you've got to push back from the states. Right? You've got to have lawsuits in every state directed at every federal agency all the time.
Yeah.
That you won't get it from within D.C.
Yeah. You're throw one more theory past you, and then I want to get to solutions because we could get deeply depressed about the state of our country. But Senator Mike Lee has this theory. He's a staunch constitutionalist, a staunch federalist, and he argues that things like impeachment are the direct result of power and the expectation of power shifting from the local and state level to the federal level, so that when we get to presidential politics, it's everything. The president is going to decide how we live our lives, which was never supposed to be the case. I wouldn't say that it never was, but it's certainly more heightened. So we will fight to the death to win the presidency, which, by the way, makes you support the lesser evil guy, even if you don't like either choice. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I think, especially with the rise of executive orders and the power of the bureaucracy, there is power in the presidency, to be sure. So you're going to have that fight to the death. And it becomes more pressing, I think, because you've seen since mid-'80s kind of historic parity between Republicans and Democrats in Congress. And as they become more polarized, no conservative Democrats, no liberal Republicans, they can't really legislate anymore. They can't do oversight anymore. They can't even get along anymore. And so that gives even more power to the presidency because there's no active Congress, right, competing with what the president wants. So it is the choice prize that each side wants. And then they can abandon all their talk of federalism and democracy and force as much of their rules down our throats as they can get away with for 4 years. And then we change seats and start all over again.
Yeah. There does seem to be sort of a cycle where our preference for the party that we vote for in the next election is probably just the party that's not in power, and we've forgotten how bad they were.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's hard to tell. There's some political scientists who say, well, that's strategic thinking on the part of voters. I suspect it's probably not, because you don't have that kind of, at least unless they're lying to the pollsters, they don't have that level of kind of knowledge and sophistication. But they know who the president is. And generally what we've seen for the past 16 years or more is president takes power and his party, it's time to hand out the gift bag to their own small base, right? And it doesn't matter what the voters care about. They're going to try to cram through their stuff first. So with Biden, you get open borders, and we're going to have a third gender on the passports and stuff like that. And it's just, with gas prices and everything else, people lose their minds over that. And so they're like, we're getting this guy out of here. So I don't think they're calculating, how do I have one party here and another party there? Or you'd see more split ticket voting. It's just a visceral reaction to the person they perceive to be in charge,
But I will interpret that through a liberty lens, and they have generally a visceral reaction to whatever the big government did that time.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly it. Neither party is serving them in any consistent way. So they just have this dislike for the federal government. We see that in surveys, that the trust and regard for all federal institutions has gone into a nosedive, and you have much more trust of state and local. Yeah.
The title of your book, I, Citizen, seems to point, and you could either say common sense or radical solution to all these problems we're talking about, which is, again, perhaps look in the mirror and say, what am I going to do about this?
Yeah.
And let's be realistic about what I can do about this, because I can't single-handedly solve partisan politics in Washington, D.C. Right. So what is the answer?
So you've got your finger on what I hoped would be a little unique part of the book. Was I thought, okay, I'm in the final chapter. What's the answer? I've read all these books, and they all have this sort of like,
this is
here's
his new
how
thing, by the way.
What's that?
He's decided to join.
Oh, you're nice. I have the meanest cat. He's a mean SOB. He bites, he claws. He's an outdoor cat. This is a nice cat.
Yeah.
So I just thought, well, what can we do that's realistic, right? We don't have a magic wand. So it's not going to be Congress should exercise oversight. Okay, yeah, sure. People should all be angels. So I thought, well, let me just start. I was working it out in the chapter. And so it made sense to me to begin, well, what do I know best? Well, I know myself best. So let me start there with the self and then go outward from there. And then it occurred to me as I was noodling on that, and some of that's sort of, there's a little hint of theology in there, right? And a little echo of Solzhenitsyn, where I thought, well, if you just work on yourself, that's a lifetime's work, right? A single human heart is like a whole lifetime endeavor to get that in better shape. So start there. And then for some of us, maybe we go outward from there to our neighborhood, our community. Well, one way, in fact, probably for a lot of us, to make your heart better, to make you a better citizen, father, husband, coworker, whatever, all of it entails other. So start with the self, but you've got to engage with others for the self to get any kind of practice at being better. So what are you going to do with your neighbors? I got to go get to know this lady who doesn't like my son's stupid loud car, right? I got to, we got to figure, I've got to bring some potatoes when we harvest them to our neighbor up the hill who has never shared any of his peaches. Not that I'm bitter about it. So we got to go there. And then maybe from there you go to local politics and then to state. And so I just started with the inner part because I figured if nothing else, we've got to inoculate ourselves against this political tribalism. Because right now we outnumber the really bad people in this country by a lot. They don't want you to believe that. Mm-hmm. So the media coverage, everything implies that your neighbors are crazy, red, blue, partisan, lunatics. They're really not. One way to inoculate ourselves against that poison is to get to know our neighbors more.
Yeah.
Because then if my Democrat neighbor, my independent, my socialist neighbor, I can't hate as easily. Because I know some of them. And I thought, okay, the first step then is inoculation. And then from there, you can go to political action, which is going to be, I would say, big surprise, State Policy Network, state-based action, pushing back in concert against the federal government is the only solution. And then a last piece, and then maybe I'm not even answering the question you asked, the more we can engage with local and state government, which means some of us running for office, getting to know these people and holding them accountable, sending better people to our state legislatures. So engaging at all levels. These are the people who become members of Congress. And there is no path back to liberty. I hate to say it. I don't like believing this, but I'm convicted of it. There's no path back to liberty in this country that does not go through Congress. Because the way the Constitution was designed, you've got legislative supremacy. And they have become instead a minuscule shadow of what they're supposed to be. So we've got to start sending motivated federalists back into that institution. And that's a long-term rebuilding.
Yeah. So let's dig a little bit deeper because I want to talk about the State Policy Network organizations. But starting with this sort of radical localism, start with yourself first. Mm-hmm. There's hints of Jordan Peterson there, but there's also just this idea that in our hearts we understand that we do have to solve problems, and the closer they are, and the more face to face they are, somehow we work it out. Yeah. And this would be the ultimate insight of those of us that believe in the market process is that we don't know nearly as much as we think we do. The future is radically uncertain. Yeah. Nobody tells us to do this, but we start cooperating with our neighbors, usually out of necessity because, their tree fell in your yard or something like that. And out of that comes some of these virtues that classical liberals like to talk about.
Yeah.
And you start this chapter with love.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, Adam Smith would call that empathy or fellow feeling, I think was the phrase he used. But there's something about being a human being in a neighborhood and looking at another person, and you can say, I see some of myself in that person.
Yeah, yeah. There are different ways to think about love, and I'm certainly no expert. But I think that my sense and experience is that at some level it must begin with no expectation. So it's a good turn, not just a feeling. I think I talk about that in the book. It's not a feeling. That's a false. That's like Beyonce, lyrics love. So real love is always rooted in action. And for it to be genuine, it cannot come with an expectation of reciprocity. Doesn't mean that you do it foolishly forever when the person is like a jerk and they won't reciprocate, but it must begin from that genuine place. I think Thomas Frank wrote about that, like the ability, was it Passions Within Reason was his book, and he said, we've become remarkably adept at detecting deception and duplicity in other Homo sapiens. So we've also therefore had to develop something like authenticity. The only way to get past all those self-defenses in the other is by truly caring about them.
Yeah.
And I thought, when I read that, I thought that's brilliant. So yeah, you have to start there with that genuine offering. And maybe nothing's returned, right?
Yeah.
But it has to begin there.
And then you get to sort of tolerance and even something stronger than that. But it's sort of baby steps to the point where, trust is probably pretty high up on that list.
Yeah.
You don't start with trust, but,
Yeah.
love is perhaps taking the risk.
Yeah. I think
Giving
that's
people
right.
the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. Which is that extension, the bridge that then can lead to trust, right? Mutual trust. And it was Robert Franks, not Thomas Frank. He's also a great writer, different field. So.
Yeah. And sort of taking that out, like, we probably agree that the best solutions are local, starting with the individual and the family and the community. Yeah. And eventually, I'm a little skeptical of the state.
Yeah.
I'll be honest.
Sure.
But perhaps a necessary evil when we're trying to get back to Congress. But our whole philosophy at Free the People is we got to get upstream of politics and connect on values.
Right.
And I think that's the same theme in your book.
That's right.
And if we get the values right and we start from the bottom up, it's quite possible that citizens would demand more of their candidates.
That's right.
Because right now, and you document this well, the typical candidate for Congress is appealing to the lowest common denominator.
Right. That's right. We've got research that shows this, that the parties, they no longer reach out to any kind of reasonable candidate that represents most people's views. So it's this kind of echo chamber. The money gravitates to these people as well. So they're not inclined to give up anything for the good of a community. And that's all a community is. It's like or a family, right? Or a group of friends, is we are always at some point giving something and receiving something, and not born out of just transaction, but out of some kind of bond. And I think, so if you think about a polity, there has to be a similar sort of relationship. And so the one way that you could reinvigorate sort of American politics would be to give people more authority in their communities, because then they've got some stake in the game.
Yeah.
They have to work it out. Right now, what's there to decide? Are we going to zone this commercial or not? Are we going to have a leash law or not? Now, those aren't unimportant things, but people sort of check out, which is exactly what the political class wants. They don't want you engaged really in local politics, right? They don't want you paying attention. They want you to hate the other side and vote for them and then shut up and sit down.
Yeah.
And so that's what you got to figure out how to change,
So tell people a little bit about the State Policy Network, because that leads into federalism as one potential check on government power.
Oh, sure. So State Policy Network began with the idea that if you think back to the Heritage Foundation in those early years, the Reagan administration, and even before, they were a source of ideas and analysis for, right-minded or conservative people going into DC politics, right? So the thought was, well, what if you had something similar in every state where we know that the state is biased towards more expansion and more towards the left. So you need this counterweight in the form of analysis and maybe even talent to go into these institutions. And that was the original idea. And so, it's 63, 64 state-based groups now, litigation centers, think tanks, independent journalism, and so on. And the thought is you can build this interconnected web of state-based institutions that are trying to influence policy in the states. What we've realized in recent years is even if we're successful and every state capital becomes, pick your flavor, libertarian or conservative nirvana, we still lose because every state will become an administrative district of Washington, D.C. We've got to have some concerted pushback against federal agencies. And so that's not all of our energy, certainly. We're still about state policies that work, but trying to find ways to together begin to push against these agencies through litigation or other kinds of legislation.
So we've partnered with one of your groups, Robert Alt from Buckeye Institute.
Yeah.
Speaking of litigation and reining in the administrative state, and actually had him and one of his clients on the show talking about executive overreach here in Washington, D.C. But the other trend I've seen, because I'm old enough to remember SPN in the early days, and it was kind of, let's create mini heritage foundations or mini Cato institutes. And there's a broad spectrum between conservative and libertarian. But litigation's not the only thing. Communicating and even organizing citizens. I've never been of the mind that you need a 501c4 to organize citizens, because a gathering to have beers and talk about Adam Smith is not political advocacy of any kind.
Well, not yet. They might try to define it that way.
Yeah, they'll work on it.
Regulate it. Make sure it's safe for everyone involved.
but other like what are some other examples of what these state-based organizations do besides litigation?
So there's a research component that matters. So the one big victory everybody was excited about was in New York when you had the Empire Center state-based group. There was a legal component, so they were using FOIAs to get Department of Public Health data from the Cuomo administration, which was hiding it. They were manipulating the data essentially to cover up the fact that this man deliberately put sick people back into vulnerable populations in nursing homes, and many, many more people died. We know this from the statistics than would have died otherwise. Then he lied about it and covered it up, which is a crime. And he's a big jerk too, and a terrible governor. So a lot of reasons to dislike him. So they were on that, and then finally forcing it out into the open, and then the press finally takes notice, right? Eventually, when the New York Times eventually decides it's news, 3 years after it happens, that's investigative journalism at its finest. So that was a great victory. Or if you mentioned communications, if you go to Illinois and the Illinois Policy Institute, and that terrible corrupt speaker of the state house there, Madigan, and they put together this really clever videos and a lot of data and stuff and interviews, and it was a documentary that took him down when nobody thought he could be taken down. So you see that kind of stuff, and there's a lot of room for that sort of creativity.
Yeah.
In part because there's such a dearth now of investigative journalism at the state level, no citizen action. And so you've got people who want to do something other than listen to talk radio and watch Fox News. They want to do something. And so these organizations are a channel for that action.
You talk a lot about the corporate media as I've started using that phrase, and I'm comfortable with it, but it's sort of the blob of media that seems to be intimately intertwined with the state, meaning the federal government. And I have sort of a public choice theory as to why that is, because our government now spends an insane amount of money on advertising on social media.
That's right.
And so
do other governments.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be some sort of deep state conspiracy and just them chasing dollars, and they're flowing from these big corporations and the government itself, and that is incentive enough for them to be lapdogs for those interests.
Yeah, that's right.
But I guess SPN, I guess I knew this, but this component of citizen journalism and doing the digging and FOIA requests, there's a lot of power there.
There is, and we're also stressing something we call owned audience, which is you've got to maintain your own, and you know this better than anyone. You're doing it before most people. You've got to have your own access to your viewers, readers, listeners. You've got to have a direct channel, because Facebook, Twitter, all these platforms, even like a MailChimp, the people who pose as just service providers, the people who run them hate us, and they hate our ideas, and they will choke you out. And so you've got to have, however you do it, direct access. In North Carolina, you got the Locke Foundation. Their direct access is they mail the newspaper. They're the third largest newspaper in the state of North Carolina. In others, it's more tech-oriented, but direct access so that you don't depend on these overseers of big established media to decide what is legitimate news and what is not.
Yeah. This is my, yes, and I personally, I've all but stopped doing so-called earned media because you get a little bit dumber every time you go on MSNBC or Fox. It's the same thing where you have 15 seconds to shout at the camera.
Yeah.
And we explicitly built this program because, as Joe Rogan claims, that sometimes you need 3 hours to tease out an idea.
That's right.
I'm not sure I can talk for 3 hours, but the sentiment is exactly right.
Yeah.
But the other piece, and I'm trying to convince my nonprofit friends that if you want to participate in owned media, be comfortable being an influencer yourself. And you don't have to be cynical. You don't have to do clickbait. You don't have to do tribalism. It's a little bit harder if you don't do those things.
Yeah, right.
And I could name names of people that do all those things in a very destructive way.
Yep.
But I think there's an audience, and maybe somewhat synonymous with people that register as independents, but particularly young people are interested in conversations that don't tell them what to think, but allow them the space to think for themselves.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the revolution.
Yeah, I think that's right. And they want generosity. So in a discussion, they want for people to be generous to one another in the discussion. They want to see that as well. You can do a 3-hour podcast. People will listen. You know, they do have the attention span for it, right? We forget that. And you probably notice this on Twitter. I'm not anywhere your following size on Twitter, but I'll tweet something that for whatever reason gets picked up by someone on the left is like or on the right is, oh yeah, that's right. And then you'll get a bunch of followers for a while, a bunch of new followers, because they're like, oh, he's one of us. But then sooner or later, you're going to tweet something that disappoints them and you lose them all again.
Right.
So they're ephemeral, right?
Yeah.
They're out there looking for that, dopamine hit. But there's a base. Your base over time are the people who think, I don't want to be in a tribe other than my people that I live around and love. Like, that's my tribe, right? My people.
I was adamantly anti-lockdown, and I think I've collected some followers that are going to be disappointed by some of my other libertarian views. And that's okay. We'll work it out together.
I had some tweet on like big medicine or big pharma or something, and it got a lot of folks who are more on the left. Because the pronouns are in the bio. That's how you can usually tell you got the left wingers. And then I'm losing them all because I said something that the right likes. I'm getting all the MAGA people. So it's all right. It balances out.
So how do people find your book and find more about you and SPN if they want to?
Well, I like to say that my book is available wherever David French's books are available. It's a little jab at David French. I met him.
We should do a whole show jabbing at David French.
I said some mean things in there, and then I saw him sitting alone in a restaurant. Believe it or not, I'm like, I think that's David French. And I went and sat down with my wife, and I said, I think it's David French over there. And she, right away, because she'd read a draft of the book, she said, you should go apologize. So I went and pre-apologized, which I'm sure he doesn't remember. Anyway, it's available Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Target and Walmart and everywhere. You can go to iCitizenBook.com, I think, and find something there. You go to my website, TonyWoodlief.com. There's all kinds of ways to get it. So I encourage people to buy, early and often. As many as they want. There's no penalty for buying more.
There's no reason not to give the same book every Christmas.
I think that's right, because if people don't behave differently, they obviously did not imbibe the message and they need it again.
Yeah.
So go ahead and buy a box now.
Beat them over the head with it.
Yeah.
What about SPN?
So SPN, you go to spn.org, and You see, you can see a map and see state-based groups in every state, whatever state you're in. You see which groups are in our network that you might want to connect with. There's a lot of policy stuff out there. We're going to start putting more content up specifically on federalism, not like nerdy theory. There's other groups that do that a lot better, but simply practical federalism. What does this mean right now for how we're governed?
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that show, make sure that you like and subscribe. Click the little bell so that you get notifications. And if you consume this via podcast, go wherever you want to go. We're everywhere. Kibbe on Liberty. The revolution starts now.